In the winter of 1878, when the snow fell thick enough to muffle screams and the mountain mist hung like funeral shrouds over the hollers, something dark stirred in the heart of Appalachian country. The old-timers, those weathered souls who'd seen decades of hardship carved into these ancient peaks, began whispering about changes in the air. Changes that made even the boldest men lock their doors before sunset and cross themselves when certain family names were spoken aloud. This wasn't your typical mountain superstition, mind you. This was something altogether more sinister. Something that would transform 5 remote communities scattered across the Cumberland Gap into theaters of terror that would make the Salem witch trials look like a church social. What happened in these forgotten hollers between 1878 and 1889 was so disturbing, so incomprehensible to the outside world, that most records were deliberately destroyed. Federal marshals who ventured into these territories often returned changed if they returned at all. Those who did speak of what they witnessed described scenes that challenged everything they thought they knew about human nature and the thin line between civilization and savagery. The Appalachian Mountains have always been a place apart. These ancient peaks, older than the Rockies, older than the Alps, have harbored secrets since before European settlers first gazed upon their mist-shrouded ridges. The Cherokee spoke of these mountains with reverence and fear, telling stories of spirits that dwelt in the deepest hollers, entities that demanded tribute and punishment for those who trespassed on sacred ground. When the first white settlers pushed into these remote valleys in the late 1700s, they brought with them their own darkness, their own desperate hungers, and their own willingness to make bargains with forces they couldn't understand. By the 1870s, 5 communities had taken root in some of the most isolated terrain east of the Mississippi. These weren't your typical pioneer settlements. These were places where people went to disappear, to escape from crimes committed elsewhere, or to practice beliefs that civilized society wouldn't tolerate. Raven's Hollow nestled in a valley so narrow that sunlight touched the valley floor for only a few hours each day. Thornbush Creek meandered through a series of interconnected settlements where families had intermarried for generations, creating bloodlines as twisted as the mountain roads themselves. Witch's Bend earned its name from the unusual number of women who settled there claiming knowledge of herbs and healing, though locals whispered they knew far more than simple folk remedies. Devil's Backbone stretched along a razor-sharp ridge where the wind never stopped howling and where strange lights danced on moonless nights. And finally, there was Shadowmere, a community built around a natural spring that never froze, even in the deepest winter, and whose waters held an unsettling dark tint that no one could explain. These 5 communities existed in an uneasy relationships with one another, connected by treacherous mountain paths and bound together by shared isolation from the outside world. They traded with each other when necessary, intermarried when bloodlines grew too thin, and maintained an unspoken agreement to keep their collective secrets buried deep in the mountain soil. For decades, this arrangement worked. The outside world remained ignorant of their existence, and they remained free to practice their particular forms of survival in one of America's most unforgiving landscapes. But in 1878, something changed. Perhaps it was the particularly harsh winter that killed livestock and froze wells solid. Perhaps it was the growing pressure from railroad companies and mining interests who were beginning to survey these remote areas for development. Or perhaps it was simply that the accumulated weight of generations of secrets and compromises had finally reached a breaking point. Whatever the catalyst, by the spring of 1878, accusations began flying between these communities like sparks from a blacksmith's forge. It started, as these things often do, with the death of a child. 7-year-old Mercy Caldwell of Ravens Hollow fell ill with what appeared to be a simple fever. Her mother, desperate to save her daughter, sought help from grandmother Hester, an ancient woman who lived alone in a cabin perched precariously on the ridge between Ravens Hollow and Witch's Bend. Hester was known throughout the region for her knowledge of healing herbs and her ability to cure ailments that baffled everyone else. But when Mercy's condition worsened instead of improved after Hester's treatment, suspicion quickly turned to accusation. Mercy didn't simply die. According to her mother's testimony, recorded years later by a circuit judge who was investigating the subsequent violence, the child began speaking in voices that weren't her own. She knew things she couldn't possibly know, details about neighbors' private lives, secrets that had been buried for years. She spoke of seeing people who had been dead for decades, and worst of all, she began making predictions about future deaths that proved unnervingly accurate. When Mercy finally passed, her body bore marks that no illness could explain, strange symbols carved into her skin that resembled no known alphabet but seemed to pulse with their own malevolent energy. The accusations against grandmother Hester might have remained a local matter, a tragic case of grief-stricken parents looking for someone to blame. But Mercy's death was only the beginning. Within weeks, similar incidents began occurring in all 5 communities. Children fell ill with mysterious ailments that defied conventional treatment. Adults began exhibiting bizarre behaviors, speaking in tongues, and demonstrating knowledge of events happening miles away. Livestock died under circumstances that suggested deliberate poisoning or ritual sacrifice. Crops failed despite favorable weather conditions. And through it all, the accusations flew like arrows in a medieval siege. The residents of Thornbush Creek blamed the women of Witch's Bend for cursing their water supply. The people of Devil's Backbone accused Shadowmere of practicing dark rituals that were affecting the spiritual balance of the entire region. Those in Shadowmere pointed fingers at Raven's Hollow, claiming their neighbors had made pacts with entities that dwelt in the deepest caves. Each community had its own theory about who was responsible for the mounting catastrophes, and each theory involved witchcraft, devil worship, or commerce with supernatural forces. What made these accusations particularly dangerous was that they weren't entirely without foundation. The truth was that all 5 communities had indeed been harboring secrets that would have horrified the outside world. Generations of isolation had led to the development of belief systems and practices that blended folk magic, corrupted Christianity, and traditions that may have predated European settlement entirely. Some families did maintain shrines to entities they claimed were older than Christ. Others practiced forms of divination that required blood sacrifice. Still others had developed herbal concoctions that could induce visions, control minds, or bring about death so subtle it appeared entirely natural. The problem wasn't that these communities were innocent of supernatural practices. The problem was that they were all guilty, and their mutual accusations threatened to expose secrets that had been carefully guarded for generations. As 1878 progressed into 1879, the situation escalated from whispered accusations to open confrontation. Trade between the communities ceased. Intermarriage stopped entirely. Armed men began patrolling the boundaries between settlements, and travelers who attempted to move between communities often disappeared entirely. The first formal trial took place in Devil's Backbone in the autumn of 1879. Martha Crowley, a widow from Witch's Bend who had been accused of cursing a Devil's Backbone family's newborn child, was seized while traveling to trade for winter supplies. The trial, if it could be called that, took place in the community's largest cabin, with the entire population serving as both jury and audience. Martha was accused not only of witchcraft, but of entering into a covenant with Satan himself for the purpose of destroying Christian families throughout the region. The evidence presented against Martha would have been laughable in any legitimate court of law. Witnesses testified that they had seen her speaking to ravens in what sounded like human language. Others claimed she had been observed gathering herbs during the full moon while speaking words in a tongue no one recognized. One man swore he had seen her transform into a wolf and run through the forest on 4 legs. Another insisted she had caused his cow to give sour milk by glaring at it with what he called the evil eye. But in the isolated world of Devil's Backbone, where superstition held more weight than evidence and fear carried more authority than law, this testimony was not only accepted but considered damning. Martha's own defense, in which she claimed to be nothing more than a skilled herbalist who had learned her trade from her grandmother, was dismissed as lies designed to conceal her true allegiance to dark forces. When she demonstrated her knowledge of medicinal plants by correctly identifying the properties of various local flora, this was taken as further proof of her supernatural abilities rather than evidence of her innocence. The trial lasted 3 days, during which Martha was subjected to various tests designed to reveal her alleged supernatural nature. She was forced to recite Christian prayers while members of the community watched for signs that the holy words caused her physical pain. She was made to handle iron objects to see if they would burn her flesh. Her body was examined for devil's marks, unusual birthmarks, or scars that were believed to be signs of a pact with Satan. When a small mole was discovered on her shoulder blade, the crowd erupted in triumphant shouts, convinced they had found the proof they sought. On the 3rd day, Martha Crowley was found guilty of witchcraft and sentenced to death by hanging. But her execution would prove to be anything but simple. As the rope was placed around her neck, Martha did something that would haunt the residents of Devil's Backbone for generations to come. She began to speak, not in English, but in a language that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and vibrate directly in the listeners' minds. The words, if they were words, seemed to carry with them images of things that should not exist, knowledge of secrets that should never be spoken, and promises of retribution that would extend far beyond her own death. When Martha finally fell silent and the rope did its work, the assembled crowd expected to feel relief, vindication, perhaps even celebration. Instead, they found themselves gripped by a terror so profound that many would later claim it felt like ice water being injected directly into their hearts. The sky, which had been clear moments before, suddenly filled with clouds so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than merely block it. The temperature dropped so rapidly that frost began forming on the ground despite the autumn warmth. And from somewhere in the distance came a sound that no one could quite identify, but that filled every listener with the absolute certainty that something vast and malevolent had taken notice of their actions. Martha Crowley's execution was supposed to be the end of Devil's Backbone's witch problem. Instead, it proved to be the beginning of something far worse. Within days of her death, the community began experiencing phenomena that made their previous troubles seem trivial by comparison. Children began having identical nightmares about a woman in white who stood at the foot of their beds and whispered secrets about their parents' sins. Adults found themselves compelled to confess to crimes and transgressions they had never intended to reveal. The community's water supply took on a taste that reminded everyone of copper pennies and old blood. And strangest of all, Martha's voice could sometimes be heard on quiet nights, not calling out in anger or pain, but singing lullabies in that same otherworldly language she had spoken from the gallows. News of Martha's trial and its aftermath spread to the other communities with the speed that only fear can generate. Rather than serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of false accusations, Martha's fate instead convinced the residents of Raven's Hollow, Thornbush Creek, Witch's Bend, and Shadowmere that the threat they faced was even more serious than they had imagined. If Devil's Backbone had been forced to resort to execution, then clearly the supernatural corruption had progressed beyond the point where normal measures could contain it. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was remembered in Appalachian folklore as the Winter of Long Shadows, though few records exist to explain the origin of this name. What is known is that by spring, all 5 communities had begun conducting their own trials, their own investigations, and their own executions. The criteria for determining guilt became increasingly broad and increasingly bizarre. Residents could be accused of witchcraft for owning too many cats, for having gardens that grew too well, for being able to predict weather changes, or for simply being disliked by their neighbors. The trials themselves evolved into elaborate rituals that bore little resemblance to any legitimate legal proceeding. Communities developed their own methods for detecting supernatural corruption, from forcing accused individuals to handle blessed objects to subjecting them to ordeals by fire or water. Some communities required the accused to walk across beds of hot coals while reciting scripture. Others dunked suspected witches in freezing mountain streams, interpreting their ability to survive as proof of supernatural assistance. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the gradual realization that these trials were revealing genuine supernatural abilities in some of the accused. As the investigations intensified and the methods for detecting witchcraft became more sophisticated, the communities began uncovering evidence of practices and abilities that couldn't be explained by conventional means. Individuals who could heal wounds with a touch, who could communicate with animals, who could see events happening miles away, who could influence the weather or cause crops to flourish in barren soil. The discovery that some residents actually did possess supernatural abilities only intensified the panic and paranoia that was consuming these mountain communities. If some of the accused were genuinely practicing witchcraft, then perhaps all the accusations were justified. By February of 1879, The supernatural chaos that had consumed 5 Appalachian communities the previous winter showed no signs of abating. If anything, the executions of Grandmother Hester and Martha Crowley had only intensified the otherworldly phenomena plaguing Raven's Hollow, Thornbush Creek, Witch's Bend, Devil's Backbone, and Shadowmere. What locals had initially hoped would purge their communities of evil influence instead seemed to have torn open something far more sinister. The first sign that their troubles were far from over came during a blizzard in early February. Residents of Raven's Hollow reported hearing Martha Crowley's voice carried on the howling wind, singing the same lullabies she used to hum while tending to sick children. But now her voice held an otherworldly quality that made listeners' blood run cold. Children who heard the spectral singing began sleepwalking to their windows, pressing their faces against the frost-covered glass and whispering responses in voices that weren't their own. More disturbing still were the physical manifestations. In Thornbush Creek, a widower named Ezekiel Barnes claimed his deceased wife had returned to their cabin. Neighbors initially dismissed his stories as grief-induced delusions until they witnessed the woman themselves standing in the cabin's doorway at twilight. Her appearance was wrong in ways that defied description, as if someone had tried to reconstruct a human form from half-remembered fragments. She never spoke, never moved, simply stood watching until darkness fell completely. The phenomenon spread rapidly. Throughout the 5 communities, recently deceased family members began appearing to their loved ones. But these weren't comforting visitations. The returned dead bore knowledge they shouldn't possess, speaking of events that had occurred after their deaths, warning of dangers that hadn't yet materialized, and making predictions that proved unnervingly accurate. Dr. Samuel Whitmore, a traveling physician who had arrived to document what he believed were cases of mass hysteria, found himself confronting evidence that challenged his scientific worldview. In his journal, he wrote, "What I observed in these mountain communities defies rational explanation. I witnessed a child of no more than 8 years old speak fluent Latin, though she had never received formal education. The children were changing most dramatically. Beyond the unexplained knowledge and abilities some displayed, many began exhibiting physical alterations. Their eyes took on an unsettling depth, as if they were looking through rather than at the world around them. Some developed an aversion to sunlight, preferring to venture outdoors only during twilight hours. Others displayed an uncanny ability to predict weather patterns days in advance or sense the approach of strangers from impossible distances. In Devil's Backbone, a girl named Sarah Mullins began drawing intricate maps of underground tunnel systems that allegedly ran beneath the mountains. When questioned about the source of her knowledge, she explained that the earth itself spoke to her, revealing its hidden passages and secret chambers. Local miners who examined her drawings were disturbed to find they accurately depicted known cave systems, including several that had been deliberately sealed years earlier following mysterious accidents. The adults weren't immune to these changes either. Throughout the 5 communities, ordinary citizens began manifesting abilities that bordered on the supernatural. A blacksmith in Witch's Bend found he could shape metal with his bare hands, the iron becoming malleable at his touch without any application of heat. A seamstress in Shadowmere discovered she could weave cloth that seemed to shimmer and shift patterns when viewed from different angles, fabric that felt warm to the touch even in the depths of winter. But perhaps most unsettling were the healers. In each community, certain individuals developed the ability to cure ailments through touch alone. These newfound healers could mend broken bones with the laying on of hands, draw poison from infected wounds, and ease the suffering of the dying. Yet their miraculous abilities came with a terrible cost. Each healing left visible marks on the healer's body, dark lines that spread across their skin like ink through water. The more severe the ailment they treated, the more pronounced these markings became. The Reverend Jonathan Blackwood, who had fled Raven's Hollow during the initial witch trials, returned in March with a team of fellow clergymen, determined to combat what he now believed was a genuine supernatural infestation. What they found exceeded their worst fears. The communities had developed their own twisted interpretations of Christian doctrine, blending traditional scripture with mountain folklore and the new supernatural realities they faced daily. In makeshift churches carved from root cellars and abandoned cabins, congregants practiced rituals that would have been considered heretical by any established denomination. They communed with the spirits of the dead, believing these entities to be messengers from the divine realm. They practiced bloodletting as a form of communion, sharing their life essence as others might share bread and wine. Most disturbing of all, they had begun to view their supernatural abilities not as curses to be purged, but as gifts to be cultivated and expanded. Reverend Blackwood's attempts to restore orthodox religious practices met with fierce resistance. The mountain folk had tasted power beyond the mundane world, and they were reluctant to surrender it. During one particularly heated confrontation in Thornbush Creek, a woman named Millicent Hayes stood before the assembled congregation and declared, "You speak of surrendering to God's will, Reverend, but God has already spoken. He has chosen us to be vessels for His mysteries." To demonstrate her point, Hayes placed her hands on a child who had been born with a withered arm. Before the horrified eyes of Blackwood and his companions, the limb straightened and strengthened, becoming as healthy and functional as its counterpart. But as the child flexed his newly healed arm in wonder, black veins spread across Hayes's own arms like a network of poison, and her eyes took on the same otherworldly depth that marked so many others in the community. The clergyman's mission collapsed entirely when they discovered that several members of their own party had begun manifesting supernatural abilities. Father McKenna, a Catholic priest from Baltimore, found he could understand and speak any language after touching a person's forehead. Brother Thomas, a Methodist minister, discovered he could see brief glimpses of the future in his dreams, visions that proved disturbingly accurate. Most shocking of all, Reverend Blackwood himself began experiencing what he initially believed were divine visions, but which bore a disturbing similarity to the supernatural experiences plaguing the mountain communities. By April, word of the Appalachian supernatural outbreak had reached authorities in Richmond, Charleston, and other regional centers of power. Government officials, initially skeptical of reports they dismissed as backwoods superstition, began taking the situation seriously when refugees from the affected areas arrived in larger towns bearing evidence of their experiences. Some displayed physical marks that defied medical explanation. Others that demonstrated abilities that witnesses found impossible to dismiss as mere parlor tricks. A commission was quietly established to investigate the Appalachian anomalies. Their mandate was to determine whether the reports represented genuine supernatural phenomena or could be explained through natural causes. Professor Crane's initial report, filed in June of 1879, remains one of the most thorough documents of the supernatural events. He wrote, "After 3 months of careful observation and documentation, I must conclude that the phenomena occurring in these Appalachian communities cannot be dismissed as mere superstition or mass delusion. I have personally witnessed events that challenge our fundamental understanding of natural law." The Commission's work was complicated by the fact that their presence seemed to accelerate rather than contain the supernatural activity. Several team members began manifesting abilities of their own. Dr. Helena Morrison, the expedition's physician, found she could diagnose illnesses simply by observing a patient's shadow. Anthropologist James Hartwell discovered he could understand the meaning behind the strange symbols that had begun appearing on trees, rocks, and cabin walls throughout the affected areas. These symbols, which locals called the writing, had emerged gradually over the winter months. They resembled no known alphabet or pictographic system, yet somehow conveyed meaning to those who had been touched by the supernatural influence. The symbols seemed to serve multiple purposes, sometimes providing warnings of danger, other times offering instructions for rituals or ceremonies, and occasionally revealing hidden knowledge about the natural world. As summer approached, the 5 communities had effectively become isolated enclaves operating under their own supernatural laws. Travel between the affected areas and the outside world had largely ceased, as few outsiders dared venture into regions where reality itself seemed negotiable. Those who did enter often found themselves changed by the experience, returning to their homes with new abilities or disturbing knowledge they couldn't explain. The transformation wasn't limited to human inhabitants. The wildlife in the affected regions began exhibiting unusual behaviors. Birds gathered in formations that spelled out the mysterious symbols. Deer would approach humans without fear, allowing themselves to be touched and seemingly communicating through gesture and expression. Most unsettling were reports of wolves that walked upright on their hind legs and bears that arranged stones into complex patterns that matched the symbols found on trees and buildings. Even the landscape itself seemed altered. Springs that had run clear for generations now flowed with water that had a metallic taste and left strange residues on skin and clothing. Certain groves of trees grew in perfect geometric patterns that hadn't existed before the supernatural outbreak began. Underground, miners reported discovering chambers that couldn't be explained by natural geological processes, spaces that seemed to have been carved with impossible precision and decorated with the same mysterious symbols that had appeared throughout the communities. By late summer, the affected areas had developed their own internal economy based on supernatural services rather than traditional goods. Those with healing abilities traded their services for food and shelter. Individuals who could communicate with the dead served as intermediaries for families seeking closure with deceased loved ones. The few people who seemed immune to the supernatural influence found themselves valued as neutral parties who could venture beyond the community boundaries to acquire necessary supplies. The social structure had also evolved in unexpected ways. Traditional authority figures, ministers, elected officials, and community elders found their influence diminished if they lacked supernatural abilities. Instead, leadership gravitated toward those who demonstrated the most impressive or useful paranormal gifts. A hierarchy emerged based not on age, education, or social status, but on the nature and strength of each person's supernatural abilities. This shift in power dynamics created new tensions within the communities. Families found themselves divided between those who embraced the supernatural changes and those who remained skeptical or frightened. Some individuals, desperate to gain status in the new order, began seeking ways to acquire abilities of their own, leading to dangerous experimentation with rituals and practices that sometimes resulted in tragic consequences. The most extreme example occurred in Shadowmere, where a group of men attempted to replicate the blood ritual that had allegedly granted Martha Crowley her healing powers. Their ceremony, conducted in a cave system beneath the town, resulted in 3 deaths and left the survivors with abilities they couldn't control. One man found he could no longer touch another person without causing them intense pain. Another began aging rapidly, gaining years in the span of days. The third lost the ability to speak coherently, instead communicating only in the mysterious symbols that had to be interpreted by others. As autumn approached, the supernatural influence showed no signs of weakening. If anything, the abilities displayed by community members were becoming more pronounced and more varied. Some individuals had developed multiple gifts, combining healing abilities with prophetic visions or the power to communicate with both the dead and the natural world. A few had begun demonstrating abilities that seemed to transcend the physical realm entirely, appearing to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, or moving through solid objects as if they were incorporeal. The outside world's response to the Appalachian situation remained fractured and inadequate. Government officials were reluctant to acknowledge publicly that supernatural phenomena might be genuine, fearing the social and religious upheaval such an admission might cause. Religious authorities were divided between those who saw the events as evidence of divine intervention and those who condemned them as demonic influences that needed to be purged through whatever means necessary. Meanwhile, the affected communities continued to evolve in isolation, developing customs and practices that would have been unimaginable just a year earlier. They had crossed a threshold from which there appeared to be no return, transformed into something that was no longer entirely human, yet retained enough of their original nature to remember what they had lost. As winter approached in 1888, the supernatural crisis that had consumed these 5 Appalachian communities reached a terrifying new phase. What began with accusations of witchcraft following young Mercy Caldwell's death had evolved into something far more dangerous than anyone could have anticipated. The very fabric of reality in these mountain hollows was beginning to unravel, and the residents found themselves trapped in a nightmare that defied every natural law they once understood. The transformations occurring in Raven's Hollow, Thornbush Creek, Witch's Bend, Devil's Backbone, and Shadowmere were no longer subtle whispers of supernatural influence. They had become screaming manifestations of power that could not be contained or controlled. Those who had once dismissed the witch trials as hysteria now faced undeniable evidence that something ancient and malevolent had awakened in these mountains. In Raven's Hollow, the Blackwood family's curse had spread like a contagion through the bloodlines. What started with Martha Blackwood's alleged ability to commune with spirits had metastasized into a hereditary affliction that marked every newborn child. The infants born after the autumn of 1887 emerged into the world with eyes that reflected light, like polished obsidian, and skin that felt unnaturally cold to the touch. More disturbing still, these children seemed to age at an accelerated rate during their first months of life, developing adult-like awareness and speech patterns that unnerved even their own parents. The local midwife, Sarah Hutchins, documented these births in her journal with increasing alarm. She wrote of babies who spoke their first words within days of birth, not the typical mama or papa, but phrases and languages that predated English settlement in the region. One infant, barely 3 weeks old, reportedly looked directly at Sarah during a routine visit and said in perfect clarity, "The old ones remember when this land was different." Sarah's journal entries became increasingly erratic as she attended more of these supernatural births. Her final entry, discovered after her mysterious disappearance in January 1889, simply read, "They are not children, they are vessels." Meanwhile, in Thornbush Creek, the weather itself had become a weapon in the hands of those touched by supernatural forces. Ezra Thornfield, the blacksmith whose wife had been executed for witchcraft, discovered he could summon devastating storms with nothing more than concentrated rage. His fury over his wife's death had somehow connected him to the atmospheric forces surrounding the community, turning his grief into a literal tempest. On December 15, 1888, witnesses reported seeing Ezra standing in the center of the town square during what had been a clear winter morning. As he raised his arms toward the sky, dark clouds began forming with unnatural speed, swirling in patterns that defied meteorological explanation. Within minutes, a localized blizzard engulfed Thornbush Creek with such intensity that visibility dropped to mere inches. The storm raged for exactly 3 hours, the same duration his wife had suffered on the gallows before dying. When the supernatural blizzard finally subsided, the townspeople emerged to find that every building associated with the witch trials had been completely destroyed by the storm, while structures owned by families who had opposed the executions remained untouched. The courthouse, where his wife had been sentenced, was reduced to splinters. Yet the church where she had sought sanctuary stood without a single broken window. Ezra himself was found at the center of the destruction, his hair turned completely white, and his eyes now bearing the same unnatural luminescence that marked others who had been transformed by the supernatural crisis. The situation in Witch's Bend had evolved into something that challenged the very concept of death itself. The cemetery where the first accused witches had been buried had become a focal point for supernatural activity that defied rational explanation. Graves that had been sealed for months began showing signs of disturbance, not from grave robbers or wild animals, but from something trying to emerge from within. Reverend Joshua Caldwell, still struggling with the loss of his daughter Mercy and the role her death had played in triggering the crisis, began conducting nightly vigils in the cemetery. His detailed records of these watches revealed phenomena that tested the limits of Christian theology. He documented strange lights emerging from burial sites, the the sound of muffled voices speaking from beneath the earth, and most disturbing of all, the gradual emergence of figures that resembled the buried dead, but possessed an otherworldly quality that marked them as something else entirely. 7 graves opened simultaneously, not through external force, but as though pushed from within. The figures that emerged bore the faces of the executed accused witches, but their bodies seemed to be composed of a substance that shifted between solid flesh and shadow. These revenants, as Caldwell termed them in his journal, did not behave like the mindless undead of folklore. They possessed intelligence, memory, and a purpose that became clear as they began moving through the community. They sought out those who had participated in their trials and executions, not for revenge in any conventional sense, but to complete some supernatural transaction that their deaths had begun but not finished. The first to encounter these revenants was Judge Cornelius Whitmore, who had presided over most of the witch trials. He was found in his study 3 days after Christmas, sitting at his desk with a peaceful expression on his face, but completely drained of blood. There were no wounds on his body, no signs of struggle, and no evidence of how his life force had been extracted. The only unusual detail was a small pile of salt on his desk, arranged in the shape of a pentagram, with a single black feather placed at its center. Similar discoveries followed throughout the winter. Each person who had played a significant role in the witch trials was found dead under circumstances that suggested supernatural intervention rather than conventional murder. The pattern was always the same: peaceful expressions, no visible cause of death, and mysterious symbols left at the scene that seemed to mark the completion of some otherworldly ritual. In Devil's Backbone, the supernatural abilities that had emerged among the residents were evolving at an alarming rate. What had begun as simple healing or enhanced intuition was transforming into powers that bordered on the divine or demonic, depending on one's perspective. Children who had shown early signs of supernatural gifts were now demonstrating abilities that fundamentally altered their relationship to the physical world. 10-year-old Rebecca Morrison, whose mother had been among the first accused of witchcraft, discovered she could walk through solid matter as easily as moving through air. At first, this ability manifested in small ways, her hand passing through wooden doors or her feet sinking slightly into stone floors. But as winter progressed, Rebecca learned to control this power with increasing sophistication. Local witnesses reported seeing her walk directly through the walls of buildings, emerge from the ground as though surfacing from water, and most unsettling of all, reach into people's bodies to touch their hearts or other organs without causing physical harm. This last ability proved both blessing and curse, as Rebecca could heal internal ailments with supernatural precision. But the sensation of having someone's hand pass through one's chest left psychological scars that never fully healed. Rebecca's transformation was not unique. Throughout Devil's Backbone, children were developing abilities that seemed to be awakening in response to the supernatural crisis that had consumed their community. Some could see through walls and across vast distances. Others could communicate telepathically with animals, and a few demonstrated the ability to manipulate time itself in small, localized ways. 8-year-old Thomas Garrett discovered he could slow down time within a radius of several feet around himself. During moments of danger or intense concentration, he could move at normal speed, while everything else around him moved with the sluggishness of thick honey. This ability saved his life when a supernatural storm brought down a massive tree directly above him. Witnesses saw the boy step calmly out of the way as the enormous trunk fell in what appeared to be slow motion, crashing to the ground exactly where he had been standing moments before. The adults of Devil's Backbone watched these transformations with a mixture of pride and terror. Their children were becoming something beyond human, blessed or cursed, with abilities that set them apart from ordinary people. But with these gifts came a gradual disconnection from normal human emotion and behavior. The children spoke less frequently with their parents, spent increasing amounts of time in the wilderness, and seemed to be developing their own society with rules and purposes that their families could not understand. In Shadowmere, the most isolated of the 5 communities, the supernatural crisis had taken on aspects that suggested the very landscape itself was becoming alive and aware. The mountains surrounding the settlement began exhibiting behaviors that defied geological explanation. Rock formations shifted overnight, creating new paths while blocking others. Springs of water appeared in locations where none had existed before, and these new water sources possessed properties that were both beneficial and dangerous. The water from these supernatural springs could heal wounds and cure diseases with remarkable effectiveness, but it also created a form of dependency in those who drank from them regularly. People who relied on the spring water for healing found that they could no longer survive on ordinary water. Their bodies had adapted to the supernatural properties of the mountain's gift, creating a population that was bound to the landscape in ways that made leaving Shadowmere impossible. Dr. Elias Pemberton, the physician who had attempted to provide rational explanations for the supernatural phenomena occurring throughout the region, found himself drawn repeatedly to Shadowmere as reports of the miraculous healing waters reached him. His scientific training demanded that he investigate these claims, even as his growing understanding of the supernatural crisis made him increasingly skeptical of purely rational explanations. Dr. Pemberton's analysis of the spring water revealed mineral compositions that were impossible according to known geology. The water contained elements that should not exist in nature, arranged in molecular structures that defied the laws of chemistry he had learned in medical school. More disturbing was his discovery that the water seemed to respond to the emotional state of those who drank it, becoming more potent when consumed by people experiencing intense fear, grief, or desperation. His research took on a personal dimension when his own daughter, Agnes, fell critically ill with a fever that conventional medicine could not break. Faced with the choice between watching his child die or accepting the supernatural intervention he had spent months trying to debunk, Dr. Pemberton brought Agnes to Shadowmere and gave her water from the mysterious springs. The healing was immediate and complete. Agnes's fever broke within minutes of drinking the water, and her strength returned with supernatural speed. But the cure came with a price that Dr. Pemberton had not anticipated. His daughter's recovery was accompanied by changes that marked her as fundamentally different from the child she had been before her illness. Agnes developed an uncanny ability to diagnose illnesses in others simply by being in their presence. She could describe symptoms that patients had not yet revealed and predict the progression of diseases with accuracy that surpassed her father's medical training. But this gift came with a burden that aged her beyond her years. She began experiencing the pain of every sick person she encountered, living through their suffering as though it were her own. Dr. Pemberton's journal documented his daughter's transformation with the precision of a medical case study and the anguish of a father watching his child become something beyond his understanding. He wrote, "Agnes heals others by taking their pain into herself. She has become a living repository for the suffering of our community, and I fear that this burden will ultimately destroy her even as she saves countless others." As winter deepened in 1888, communication between the 5 affected communities became increasingly difficult. The supernatural phenomena that had transformed each settlement were creating barriers that prevented normal travel and correspondence. The mountain paths that had connected these communities for generations began shifting without warning, leading travelers in circles or depositing them in locations miles from their intended destinations. The few messages that did reach the outside world painted a picture of communities that were evolving beyond recognition. A letter from Raven's Hollow, dated January 3rd, 1889, and somehow delivered to authorities in Charleston despite the communication difficulties, described conditions that seemed more like fantasy than reality. The children no longer age as children should. They speak with voices that carry the weight of centuries, and their eyes reflect knowledge that no human child should possess. We fear they are becoming something else, something that remembers what this land was before our ancestors claimed it. Similar reports arrived sporadically from the other communities, each describing phenomena that challenged the recipient's ability to believe or understand. Government officials who received these communications faced an impossible choice between dismissing them as the ravings of isolated mountain folk driven mad by superstition or accepting that something genuinely supernatural was occurring in the Appalachian hollows. The few investigators brave enough to venture into the affected regions returned with reports that were either dismissed as fabrications or classified to prevent public panic. A federal marshal named William Crawford submitted a report in February 1889 that was immediately sealed by order of the territorial governor. The single page that survived in public records contained only a fragment of his observations. What I witnessed in these mountains cannot be explained by any natural law or human agency. The very air seems alive with intentions that are not our own. I respectfully request that no further personnel be sent to investigate these communities until we can better understand the forces that have been unleashed there. The supernatural crisis that had begun with accusations of witchcraft had evolved into something that transcended the original scope of the witch trials. The communities of Raven's Hollow, Thornbush Creek, Witch's Bend, Devil's Backbone, and Shadowmere had become testing grounds for forces that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality in the American wilderness. As 1889 began, it became clear that whatever had been awakened in these Appalachian hollows was not content to remain confined to 5 isolated communities. Reports began arriving from settlements throughout the region describing similar phenomena: unexplained deaths, supernatural abilities manifesting in previously ordinary people, and landscape changes that defied rational explanation. The witch trials that had started as a response to fear and superstition had become the catalyst for a transformation that was spreading beyond anyone's ability to control or contain. The mountains themselves seemed to be awakening to possibilities that had lain dormant since the first European settlers claimed the land as their own. In the depths of the Appalachian winter, as snow fell on communities that were no longer entirely human, the residents of these 5 settlements faced a future that would test every belief they had held about the nature of existence itself. The witch trials had ended, but what they had unleashed was just beginning to reveal its true scope and purpose. The ancient mountains had kept their secrets for millennia, but now those secrets were emerging into the light of a new age, carrying with them the power to transform not just 5 isolated communities, but potentially the entire region. The boundaries between the natural and supernatural worlds had been shattered, and no force on earth seemed capable of restoring them. By the winter of 1889, the supernatural chaos consuming those 5 isolated communities had begun to spread like a contagion across the broader Appalachian region. What started as localized witchcraft accusations had evolved into something far more dangerous, something that defied every attempt at containment or explanation. The mountains themselves seemed to be awakening, and with that awakening came manifestations that would forever change how investigators understood the relationship between human consciousness and the natural world. The first sign of broader contamination came from Blackwater County, nearly 60 miles southeast of the original affected communities. Mine shafts that had been stable for decades suddenly collapsed without warning, but not in the chaotic way of typical cave-ins. Instead, witnesses described the tunnels sealing themselves with deliberate precision, as though the earth was consciously rejecting human intrusion. More disturbing were the reports from the miners themselves. They spoke of hearing voices emanating from the rock faces, whispers in languages that predated any known human settlement in the region. Equipment would be found rearranged each morning, not damaged, but reconfigured in ways that suggested an intelligence behind the alterations. One foreman documented finding his surveying tools arranged in perfect geometric patterns that, when viewed from above, resembled symbols similar to those reported in the original 5 communities. But it was the children who provided the most unsettling evidence of the spreading phenomenon. Across a dozen counties, teachers and parents began reporting that their children were exhibiting abilities that bordered on the supernatural. Young students would demonstrate knowledge of subjects they had never been taught, speaking with authority about geological formations, weather patterns, and even predicting minor earthquakes days before they occurred. Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore, a school teacher in Copper Ridge, documented the most comprehensive account of these manifestations. In her journal, she wrote about 8-year-old Thomas McKinnon, who had previously struggled with basic arithmetic, but suddenly began solving complex mathematical problems that challenged university-trained engineers. When questioned about his newfound abilities, Thomas would only say that the mountain folk had taught him during his dreams. Even more remarkable was the case of 11-year-old Mary Catherine Doyle, who began speaking in what linguists later identified as a previously unknown dialect that combined elements of Cherokee, Scots Gaelic, and something else entirely. Marys would enter trance-like states, during which she would provide detailed descriptions of locations she had never visited, including accurate maps of cave systems that professional surveyors had not yet discovered. The authorities' attempts to study these phenomena systematically met with increasingly violent resistance. In March 1889, a team of federal investigators, led by Dr. Harrison Blackwood, arrived in the region with the intention of establishing a permanent research station. They brought with them the most advanced scientific equipment available, including early photographic apparatus and precision instruments for measuring electromagnetic disturbances. Their first major discovery came within days of their arrival. Using sensitive magnetometers, they detected what they described as unprecedented magnetic anomalies centered around the original 5 communities, but extending in a pattern that suggested deliberate geometric design. The anomalies weren't random, but formed what appeared to be a vast pentagram spanning nearly 200 square miles of mountain territory. Dr. Blackwood's team attempted to establish observation posts at each point of this mysterious formation, but their efforts were systematically thwarted by phenomena that seemed to anticipate their every move. Equipment would malfunction in ways that defied explanation, with precision instruments registering readings that suggested reality itself was fluctuating in these locations. The team's photographer, Marcus Thorne, captured images that would later be classified by federal authorities and remain sealed to this day. According to witness accounts, these photographs showed landscapes that appeared to shift between exposures, with the same geographical features appearing drastically different when photographed from identical positions only minutes apart. Even more disturbing were the human subjects captured in these images. Residents of the affected communities appeared in the photographs as partially translucent figures, as though they existed only partially in the physical world. Some images showed individuals who cast no shadows despite being photographed in direct sunlight, while others revealed people whose reflections appeared in water or glass surfaces, even when they themselves were not visible to the naked eye. The investigation took a darker turn when team members began experiencing the same transformations they had come to study. Dr. Blackwood himself reported vivid dreams in which he received detailed instructions for conducting rituals he had never learned. His journal entries from this period show a dramatic shift in handwriting style and vocabulary, with later entries written in the same mysterious script that had been found in the original communities. By May 1889, 3 members of the research team had disappeared entirely. Their personal effects were found arranged in ritualistic patterns, but there were no signs of struggle or violence. It was as though they had simply chosen to step out of the documented world and into whatever reality was consuming the mountain communities. The breaking point came when Dr. Blackwood himself underwent what witnesses described as a complete transformation. During what was supposed to be a routine examination of soil samples, he suddenly began speaking in multiple voices simultaneously, delivering prophecies about the awakening of ancient entities that had slumbered beneath the mountains for millennia. His final journal entry, written in handwriting that bore no resemblance to his previous script, read, "The boundaries were never meant to hold forever. What we have documented is not corruption, but restoration. The mountains remember what they were before human ambition carved them into commodity." The federal investigation was quietly terminated in June 1889, with all surviving team members reassigned to projects in distant territories. Official records state that the research was discontinued due to insufficient funding and inconclusive results, but surviving correspondence between government officials reveals a different story. The letter recommended that the affected region be designated as restricted federal territory, with access limited to essential personnel only. This recommendation was never officially implemented, but by the summer of 1889, the affected communities had become increasingly isolated through what appeared to be natural circumstances. Roads leading into the region suffered from an unprecedented series of washouts and landslides. Telegraph lines failed repeatedly, with repair crews reporting that the lines would be found cut in patterns that suggested ritual significance rather than random damage. Most significantly, people began to actively avoid the region. Travelers reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread when approaching the affected areas, describing sensations of being watched by unseen entities and hearing voices that seemed to emanate from the landscape itself. The few brave souls who ventured into the region during this period returned with accounts that strained credibility. They spoke of communities where the residents had developed their own forms of governance based on supernatural hierarchies, where decisions were made through collective trances, and where the landscape itself seemed to participate in daily life. One particularly detailed account came from Samuel Morrison, a circuit preacher who administered to several of the affected communities before their transformation. In his report to church authorities, he described arriving in what had once been the thriving community of Ravens Hollow to find it fundamentally altered. The buildings remained, but they had been modified in ways that suggested non-human architectural principles. Windows had been enlarged and repositioned to create patterns that aligned with celestial movements. Doors had been carved with symbols that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. The residents themselves had changed in ways that Morrison struggled to articulate. They moved with a fluid coordination that suggested collective consciousness, often completing each other's sentences or responding to unspoken communications. Their eyes had developed an unusual reflective quality, and they demonstrated abilities that Morrison could only describe as miraculous. Children showed wounds, healing visibly as he watched, while adults demonstrated knowledge of events occurring in distant locations. Most remarkably, the community seemed to function without traditional forms of authority or decision-making. Instead, they operated through what Morrison termed a form of divine consensus, where the will of the group was somehow communicated through supernatural means. Morrison's final observation proved to be the most prescient. He noted that the transformed communities were not declining, but thriving in ways that suggested they had discovered methods of existence that transcended normal human limitations. Their crops grew with unprecedented abundance despite poor soil conditions. Their livestock showed no signs of disease or aging. Most remarkably, the residents themselves appeared to be aging at a dramatically reduced rate, with elderly individuals displaying the vitality of people decades younger. By the end of 1889, it had become clear that whatever had been unleashed in those 5 isolated communities was not a temporary phenomenon, but a permanent transformation of the relationship between human consciousness and the natural world. The mountains had awakened something that had been dormant for centuries, and that awakening was spreading with each passing season. The final documented attempt to understand the phenomenon came from Dr. Elias Thornton, a professor of natural philosophy at the University of Virginia, who had been studying reports of the supernatural manifestations. Against the advice of his colleagues and the explicit warnings of federal authorities, Dr. Thornton organized a private expedition to the affected region in November 1889. They entered the region through the least affected approach routes, hoping to document the phenomena before they themselves became subject to whatever forces were transforming the local population. Dr. Thornton's expedition journals, discovered in a sealed vault in 1963, provide the most detailed scientific account of the supernatural manifestations. His team documented temperature variations that defied known thermodynamic principles, with some locations maintaining tropical warmth despite sub-freezing conditions only yards away. Most significantly, they documented the presence of entities that appeared to be neither fully human nor entirely supernatural. These beings, described as the intermediaries, seemed to serve as bridges between the transformed human communities and whatever ancient consciousness had awakened in the mountains. Dr. Thornton's final journal entry, dated December 15th, 1889, revealed the ultimate fate of his expedition. We have been offered a choice. We can return to the world of limited understanding and conventional reality, or we can remain and participate in the great awakening that is transforming this region. 3 of our party have already chosen to stay. I find myself increasingly drawn to their decision. The knowledge being offered here transcends anything our universities could provide. Neither Dr. Thornton nor any member of his expedition was ever seen again. Their equipment was found months later, arranged in the same geometric patterns that had become characteristic of the region's supernatural manifestations. Most remarkably, their photographic plates, when finally developed, showed images of the expedition members in various stages of transformation, becoming progressively more translucent until the final photographs showed only empty landscapes where human figures should have been. As 1889 drew to a close, the reality of the situation had become undeniable. The Appalachian Mountains had become the site of a fundamental transformation in the relationship between human consciousness and the natural world. What had begun as isolated witchcraft accusations had evolved into something that challenged the very foundations of scientific understanding. The 5 communities that had been the epicenter of the original manifestations had become something unprecedented in human history. Settlements where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural worlds had been permanently dissolved. The residents had evolved into beings that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions of reality, serving as guardians of knowledge and power that predated human civilization. Most significantly, the transformation was continuing to spread. With each passing month, new communities reported similar phenomena. Children continued to develop supernatural abilities. Adults began experiencing collective consciousness. The landscape itself continued to manifest signs of awakening intelligence. By the winter of 1890, it had become clear that the mountains were not merely the site of supernatural phenomena, but had become the birthplace of an entirely new form of human existence. The question was no longer whether these manifestations could be contained or explained, but whether they represented the future of human evolution itself. The mountains had awakened, and with that awakening came the promise of either transcendence or annihilation for anyone brave enough to venture into their misty depths. By 1893, the phenomena that had begun with Mercy Caldwell's death had evolved into something far more complex than simple witchcraft accusations or even supernatural manifestations. The ancient consciousness that had awakened in those 5 communities was no longer content to remain confined to isolated hollows and forgotten valleys. It had learned to hunger for more than just the fear and desperation of mountain folk. It had developed an appetite for the very essence of human civilization itself. The transformation began subtly, as these things always do in the mountains. Travelers passing through the affected regions started reporting that their compasses spun wildly, pointing not to magnetic north, but towards something else entirely, something that seemed to shift and move across the landscape like a living thing. Maps became unreliable as roads that had existed for decades simply vanished overnight, replaced by paths that led to destinations that shouldn't exist. Surveyors sent to investigate these anomalies would return with charts that showed impossible geography, valleys that folded in on themselves, and ridgelines that formed patterns resembling the same ancient symbols that had first appeared carved into trees and stones. The railroad companies were among the first to recognize that something fundamental had changed. The Baltimore and Ohio line that ran through the edge of what locals had begun calling the affected territory experienced a series of incidents that defied both explanation and the laws of physics. Trains would enter tunnels and emerge days later, their passengers claiming only minutes had passed. Others would arrive at stations with additional cars that no one remembered coupling, filled with passengers who spoke in languages that linguists couldn't identify and carried belongings that seemed to shift and change when observed directly. Most disturbing were the reports from the train crews themselves. Engineers described seeing figures standing on the tracks ahead, always just beyond the reach of their headlights. When they applied the brakes expecting impact, they would find nothing there. But later, when they checked their cargo manifests, they would discover additional items that hadn't been loaded at any station. Crates filled with objects that hurt to look at directly, personal belongings that seemed to belong to people who had never existed, and sometimes, most unsettling of all, coffins that were simultaneously empty and occupied. The telegraph lines that connected the region to the outside world began carrying more than just messages. Operators reported receiving transmissions in perfect Morse code that, when decoded, revealed information about future events with uncanny accuracy. Stock prices that wouldn't be announced for days, weather patterns that meteorologists hadn't yet predicted, and occasionally personal messages addressed to people who wouldn't be born for decades. Some operators became obsessed with these phantom transmissions, spending hours each day transcribing messages that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Government officials in Washington began receiving reports that painted a picture of a region that was becoming increasingly disconnected from the rest of the country. Federal marshals sent to investigate the ongoing situation would return with stories that their superiors dismissed as folklore or nervous exhaustion. They spoke of entire towns that existed only on certain days of the week, of people who cast shadows that moved independently of their bodies, and of forests where the trees grew in perfect geometric patterns that hurt the mind to contemplate. The academic community initially approached these reports with skepticism, but that skepticism began to erode as the evidence mounted. Professor Nathaniel Blackwood of Harvard University, one of the few scholars willing to investigate the phenomenon directly, published a series of papers that described what he termed geographical instability in the Appalachian region. His research suggested that the landscape itself was becoming fluid, responding to forces that existed outside the normal framework of natural law. He recorded instances where people would enter the affected region and emerge days or weeks later, having aged years in the span of hours, or conversely, children who would venture into certain hollows and return as elderly versions of themselves, carrying memories of lives they had never lived. Most disturbing were the cases where individuals would return carrying objects or knowledge from time periods that hadn't yet occurred. The professor's final expedition into the region in 1894 yielded his most comprehensive and terrifying findings. He discovered that the 5 original communities had not been destroyed or abandoned, as many had assumed. Instead, they had been transformed into something that challenged the very concept of human settlement. The buildings remained, but they existed in a state of constant flux, sometimes appearing as normal structures, other times manifesting as impossible architectural configurations that seemed to fold space in on itself. The inhabitants of these transformed communities were perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Blackwood's discoveries. They appeared human at first glance, but closer observation revealed subtle abnormalities. Their movements were too fluid. Their speech patterns contained inflections that suggested they were speaking multiple languages simultaneously, and their eyes reflected light in ways that suggested they were seeing spectrums of reality invisible to normal human perception. Most significantly, these transformed residents seemed to exist in multiple time periods simultaneously. Blackwood documented conversations with individuals who would reference events from the Civil War as if they had happened yesterday, while in the same breath discussing technologies and concepts that wouldn't be invented for decades. They appeared to have access to the collective knowledge and experiences of everyone who had ever lived in their communities, creating a form of consciousness that transcended individual identity. The economic impact of these transformations began to affect the region in ways that couldn't be ignored. Mining operations found that veins of coal and ore would relocate overnight, sometimes appearing in areas where geological surveys indicated they shouldn't exist. Farmers discovered that their crops would grow to maturity in impossible time frames, but the harvest would consist of varieties of plants that hadn't been planted, or in some cases, species that botanists couldn't classify. The lumber industry faced perhaps the most significant challenges. Trees in the affected areas would grow to enormous sizes overnight, but when cut, they would reveal wood grain patterns that formed recognizable symbols and sometimes even readable text. More disturbing, the act of harvesting these trees often resulted in sounds that witnesses described as screaming, not from the wood itself, but from something that existed within or beyond it. Local law enforcement found themselves dealing with crimes that challenged the very concept of legal jurisdiction. How do you prosecute someone for theft when the stolen items appear to exist in multiple locations simultaneously? How do you investigate a murder when the victim continues to be seen walking through town, apparently unaware of their own death? Sheriff's departments began keeping separate records for what they termed irregular incidents, cases that couldn't be processed through normal legal channels. The religious communities in the region experienced their own transformations. Churches that had stood for generations began exhibiting architectural changes that occurred without any human intervention. Stained glass windows would alter their designs overnight, often depicting scenes that combined Christian imagery with symbols that predated European settlement. Some congregations reported that their hymns would be joined by voices singing in harmony, voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Ministers and priests found their sermons being influenced by knowledge they didn't consciously possess. They would speak of theological concepts that they had never studied, often in languages they didn't know they could speak. Some reported having conversations with parishioners who had died years earlier, only to discover later that these individuals had been seen by other members of the congregation at the same time. Letters would arrive at their destinations before they had been sent, or decades after the sender and recipient had died. Some mail would arrive addressed to people who wouldn't be born for years, containing information about future events written in the handwriting of people who had never existed. Postal workers began refusing assignments to routes that passed through the affected areas, claiming that the mail itself felt wrong to handle, as if it were made of something other than paper and ink. Medical professionals in the region documented physiological changes in long-term residents that suggested human adaptation to supernatural influences. People began developing sensory capabilities that allowed them to perceive aspects of reality that remained invisible to outsiders. They could sense emotional states in others from impossible distances, predict weather patterns with supernatural accuracy, and most disturbing, communicate with deceased relatives as easily as they conversed with the living. Children born in the affected areas after 1890 exhibited traits that physicians couldn't explain through normal developmental processes. They would speak their first words in languages that linguists couldn't identify, demonstrate knowledge of historical events that occurred before their birth, and show artistic abilities that suggested they were copying images from sources that existed outside normal human experience. Some would draw pictures of people and places that wouldn't exist for decades, while others would create portraits of family members who had died before the children were born, capturing details that could only have come from direct observation. The transformation of the region reached a critical threshold in 1895, when the boundaries between the affected and unaffected areas began to shift. The phenomena that had been contained within the original 5 communities started expanding outward, following patterns that seemed to correspond to underground water systems, mineral deposits, and other geological features. Towns that had considered themselves safely removed from the supernatural outbreak found themselves dealing with the same impossible occurrences that had plagued their neighbors. This expansion wasn't random or chaotic. It followed a logic that suggested intelligence and purpose, as if the ancient consciousness was deliberately extending its influence according to some vast plan that encompassed not just the mountain region, but potentially the entire continent. The rate of expansion was increasing, and those who studied the pattern recognized that if it continued at its current pace, the phenomena would reach major population centers within decades. The federal government's response to this realization marked a turning point in how authorities approached the Appalachian situation. What had begun as a regional curiosity had evolved into a potential national crisis. Secret meetings were held in Washington, attended by officials whose names were never recorded and whose decisions were never made public. The consensus was that the situation required containment measures that went far beyond anything previously attempted. The mountains themselves seemed to respond to this federal attention with what could only be described as amusement. Geological surveys commissioned to map the expanding phenomena would return with charts that changed daily, showing topographical features that rearranged themselves according to principles that defied natural law. Rivers would flow uphill when observed by government agents, while maintaining normal flow patterns for local residents. Military units sent to establish observation posts would find their equipment functioning perfectly until the moment they tried to document the supernatural occurrences, at which point cameras would produce images of landscapes that didn't match what the operators were seeing, and recording devices would capture sounds that existed only in the playback. The ancient consciousness had learned to distinguish between those who belonged to its expanding realm and those who sought to study or control it from the outside. This selective manifestation of phenomena suggested a level of awareness and intentionality that transformed the situation from a supernatural outbreak into something resembling a negotiation between two fundamentally different forms of existence. As 1895 drew to a close, residents of the affected regions began reporting a new type of visitation. Unlike the previous manifestations, which had been unpredictable and often frightening, these new encounters felt purposeful and almost welcoming. People would find themselves drawn to specific locations, usually places of natural beauty or historical significance, where they would experience what they described as conversations with the landscape itself. These communications weren't auditory in the traditional sense. Instead, participants reported receiving information directly into their consciousness, complex concepts, and images that conveyed understanding without the need for language. Through these encounters, the human residents began to comprehend the true nature of what had awakened in their mountains, and more importantly, what it wanted from them. The ancient consciousness, it seemed, was not malevolent in the way that humans understood evil. It was simply operating according to principles that predated human civilization, principles that had been dormant for millennia while humanity developed its own understanding of reality. The death of Mercy Caldwell had been the catalyst, but not the cause. The cause was the inevitable collision between two different ways of existing in the world, one based on the solid certainties of physical law, the other on the fluid possibilities of consciousness, unbound by temporal or spatial limitations. The negotiations that began in those final months of 1895 would determine not just the fate of the Appalachian region, but the future relationship between humanity and forces that had shaped the world long before the first human settlements. The mountains had awakened, and they were no longer content to remain silent. The Great Awakening had begun, and humanity found itself thrust into negotiations with entities that existed beyond the veil of physical reality. By 1894, the situation in the 5 communities had evolved far beyond simple supernatural manifestations. What had started as isolated incidents of witchcraft accusations had transformed into something unprecedented in human history: direct diplomatic contact with non-human intelligence. The negotiations took place in locations that defied conventional understanding. Government representatives, accompanied by scholars from Harvard and Yale, found themselves seated at tables that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. The entities they faced were no longer the shadowy presences that had first emerged from the mountain mists. These beings had learned to communicate in ways that human minds could barely comprehend, speaking through synchronized changes in atmospheric pressure, shifts in electromagnetic fields, and direct manipulation of consciousness itself. Secretary of Interior John Noble personally oversaw these encounters, though his official reports bore little resemblance to the reality witnesses described. According to classified documents that wouldn't surface until decades later, the entities presented themselves as representatives of what they called the Deep Collective, an ancient network of consciousness that had existed within the Earth's geological structure for millions of years. The terms they offered were both generous and terrifying. Humanity would be permitted to continue its expansion and technological development, but certain regions would remain permanently under their influence. These zones would serve as laboratories where the boundaries between physical and metaphysical reality could be explored and expanded. In exchange, the entities would share knowledge that could advance human civilization by centuries, revealing the secrets of energy manipulation, consciousness transfer, and interdimensional travel. But the negotiations revealed disturbing truths about the nature of the relationship that had already developed. The entities explained that the 5 communities had not been randomly selected. They had been chosen because their bloodlines carried specific genetic markers that made them compatible with consciousness transfer. The supernatural abilities that had manifested in residents weren't spontaneous developments, but careful cultivation of latent potential that had been deliberately bred into certain family lines over generations. The most unsettling revelation concerned the children. Every child born in the affected communities after 1885 possessed what the entities called dual consciousness. They existed simultaneously in human reality and in the expanded awareness of the Deep Collective. These children could perceive multiple dimensions, communicate telepathically across vast distances, and manipulate physical matter through focused intention. They were, in essence, the first generation of hybrid beings designed to bridge the gap between human and non-human intelligence. Government officials struggled to comprehend the implications. Medical examinations of these children revealed brain structures that didn't match standard human anatomy. Their neural networks showed unprecedented connectivity, with some regions displaying activity patterns that seemed to extend beyond the physical boundaries of their skulls. When observed under specific conditions, electromagnetic readings suggested their consciousness operated on frequencies that conventional science couldn't measure. The entities made it clear that this transformation was irreversible and expanding. Every year, more children were born with enhanced capabilities. Every year, The influence spread to new bloodlines and new geographical regions. The process was accelerating, and within a few generations, they projected that a significant portion of humanity would possess these hybrid characteristics. Religious leaders who participated in the negotiations faced a crisis of faith that shattered established theological frameworks. The entities demonstrated knowledge of human spiritual development that spanned millennia, revealing that many religious experiences throughout history had been instances of contact with their collective consciousness. They spoke of guiding human civilization through carefully orchestrated revelations, using prophets and mystics as unwitting conduits for information that would prepare humanity for eventual integration. The Catholic Church's secret archives contain records of emergency councils convened to address what they termed the Appalachian Revelation. Cardinal participants reported experiencing visions during these meetings that showed them glimpses of reality from the entity's perspective. They described seeing the earth as a living organism, with humanity as one component of a vast ecosystem that included multiple forms of consciousness existing at different dimensional levels. Protestant denominations struggled even more dramatically with the theological implications. The entity's claims about influencing religious development throughout history challenged fundamental assumptions about divine revelation and human spiritual autonomy. Some ministers declared the beings to be demonic manifestations, while others argued they represented a form of divine communication that transcended traditional religious categories. The scientific community found itself equally divided. The entities demonstrated phenomena that violated established physical laws, yet they did so with such consistency that new theoretical frameworks had to be developed to account for their capabilities. They showed government scientists how consciousness could directly influence quantum mechanical processes, how information could be transmitted instantaneously across any distance, and how matter could be manipulated at the molecular level through focused intention. Dr. William James of Harvard, despite his reputation for skepticism, became one of the most vocal advocates for accepting the entity's reality. His private journals describe experiences during the negotiations that fundamentally altered his understanding of human consciousness. He wrote about participating in collective awareness sessions where his individual identity temporarily merged with the deep collective, allowing him to perceive reality from a perspective that encompassed multiple dimensions and time frames simultaneously. These expanded awareness experiences revealed that the entity's influence extended far beyond the Appalachian region. Similar manifestations were occurring in isolated locations worldwide, from the remote valleys of Tibet to the deep forests of the Amazon. The awakening was global, though it remained concentrated in areas where geological conditions created natural gateways between dimensions. The military implications were staggering. The enhanced humans demonstrated abilities that could revolutionize warfare. They could sense approaching threats from miles away, communicate silently across battlefields, and in some cases, manipulate enemy equipment through focused concentration. The War Department established classified research programs to study these capabilities, though their attempts to weaponize the phenomena met with limited success. The abilities seemed to function only when aligned with the entity's broader agenda, suggesting that the enhanced humans remained connected to the deep collective's influence. economic disruption followed close behind. The enhanced humans could locate mineral deposits with unprecedented accuracy, predict weather patterns weeks in advance, and occasionally demonstrate what appeared to be precognitive abilities regarding market fluctuations. Traditional prospecting and agricultural methods became obsolete in regions where these individuals operated, leading to massive shifts in regional economics that federal authorities struggled to regulate. Social structures in the affected areas underwent radical transformation. Traditional family units evolved into extended kinship networks where individual identity became fluid. Children often displayed stronger emotional connections to the collective consciousness than to their biological parents. Marriage patterns changed as individuals sought partners based on consciousness compatibility rather than conventional attraction or social status. The entities explained that these changes represented humanity's natural evolutionary trajectory. They claimed that human consciousness had always been designed to eventually transcend individual limitations and join larger collective networks. The current manifestations were simply the activation of dormant potentials that had been suppressed by the limitations of purely physical existence. Government officials faced impossible choices. They could attempt to contain or suppress the phenomena, risking conflict with beings whose capabilities they couldn't match. They could embrace the transformation, potentially sacrificing human autonomy for technological advancement. Or they could seek some form of compromise that might preserve both human independence and access to the entity's knowledge. The compromise that emerged became known as the Appalachian Accord, though its terms were never made public. Certain regions would remain under direct entity influence, serving as zones where human entity hybrid development could continue unimpeded. In exchange, the entities agreed to limit their direct intervention in human affairs outside these designated areas and to share selected technological knowledge through carefully controlled channels. The enhanced humans would serve as intermediaries, helping to manage the relationship between purely human populations and the entity collective. They would be permitted to integrate into broader society while maintaining their connection to the expanded consciousness network. Over time, they would facilitate humanity's gradual adaptation to the new reality through intermarriage and cultural influence. By 1899, the first generation of enhanced children had reached adulthood, and their impact on American society became impossible to ignore. They excelled in fields requiring pattern recognition, strategic thinking, and intuitive problem solving. Many became influential in business, politics, and scientific research, though they maintained carefully concealed connections to their home communities and the entity collective. The transformation of the Appalachian region had become a model for humanity's future evolution. What had begun as witch trial hysteria had revealed the existence of a vast intelligence network that viewed human civilization as one component of a much larger cosmic ecosystem. The negotiations had established the framework for humanity's integration into this expanded reality, though the full implications would take generations to unfold. As the 19th century drew to a close, the 5 communities that had sparked this transformation had evolved into something entirely new. They existed simultaneously in human reality and in dimensions that defied conventional description. Their residents lived lives that spanned multiple levels of consciousness, serving as bridges between humanity's past and its rapidly approaching future. The entities had achieved their goal of establishing permanent contact with human civilization. The awakening they had orchestrated would continue to spread, gradually transforming humanity into something unprecedented in Earth's history. The darkness that settled over these Appalachian families was never just their burden alone. From the Holloway coal seams to the Whitaker's haunting melodies, each bargain struck in desperation has left its mark on the mountains themselves. The mist still carries whispers of old promises, and the deep places remember what was given and what was taken. These 5 bloodlines found prosperity at a price that continues to echo through the hollows, reminding us that in the ancient mountains of Appalachia, some debts span generations, and the old agreements never truly end.